Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Douglas Johnson, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about meditation and personal change. And I want to do this in 3 separate talks because I have a lot that I want to cover. So this will be part of the first in 3-part series. Before I get into it, I do want to thank all of my patrons on Patreon and everyone who makes these videos possible. It may not seem like it, but it actually takes quite an investment of time, money, and energy to be able to do these videos. And given my employment as a yoga teacher, it wouldn't be possible if people out there like yourself didn't help support me financially to do this. I simply wouldn't be able to keep it up. So thank you to all of you who are contributing and making this possible for everybody. Okay. So our topic today is meditation and personal change, part 1. And this first part I'm titling roughly 4 kinds of change. So I've just noticed these things. These are things I'm sharing from my own experience. They don't come from a particular tradition or from a particular teacher. These are just things that I've noticed along the way that I want to share with you. It's my whole intention in teaching is I've learned so much from practicing spirituality and being on this journey throughout my life, and I want to share those things, and I hope that they are helpful to other people. So meditation, I've found, when it's done properly, it's very humbling. The type of meditation that I teach, it kind of shows you your personal shortcomings, your flaws, if you will. We get really clear in our mind, and we can see things very objectively, and we can begin to see how maybe some of the things that we do, some of the things that we say, some of our thoughts about other people and situations, they're really less than ideal. And this can be hard because at certain stages, certain phases of the spiritual path, we might feel a little bit like we're becoming a god, like all our problems are getting solved. And we come in contact with parts of ourselves we didn't know existed. And this can be very joyful and very blissful. And then at a certain stage, I think if you stick with it, and if you're honest with yourself and you have good guidance, and you continue, you may start to come across some things that trouble you, things about yourself that trouble you, and you may really want to change these things about yourself. You might think, this is no way for an enlightened individual to act. This is no way for someone who is spiritually awake or spiritual minded person to act. You may even think this isn't a way for just a decent person to act. There might be aspects of yourself that you really loathe or feel that are outright wrong or bad. So this is a very interesting experience. So we very often feel like we become aware of these problems, and what should we do with this awareness? I become aware of things that are not right in myself. What do I do with that? What am I supposed to do about that? And in my experience, personal change is very hard. It is the hardest thing that you'll do most likely in your life. You can call it spiritual change, you can call it personal change. It really doesn't, it's not that important to me. Spirituality is just a name that we give to really just growing as a human being, in my opinion. So some things that in a Western culture might not be called spiritual, I actually think are spiritual. They're in the domain of spirituality. And, vice versa. So spiritual work, personal change, personal growth, not self-improvement, okay? That's not really what I'm talking about. Sometimes growing has nothing to do with improving yourself. That may not make sense, but that's the truth. Sometimes growing spiritually from an outside perspective, from a worldly perspective. It has nothing to do with you being a better person per se. Okay, so I want to be clear on that. So personal change is hard, and it takes time, but it is the most rewarding thing that you'll do, in my experience. Again, I can only share my experience and the experiences that have been shared with me by students and the experiences that have been shared by my teachers. I can also, again, take from scriptures and things, but some things I share are because they are my personal experience, and I haven't read them in a scripture. And I haven't heard them addressed by a teacher, and I think they're important. So that's why I'm sharing it, okay? So in my own work on myself, I've noticed that there are basically 4 kinds of change, okay? And I want to share these with you. And if you've been on this path a while, you may have already encountered some or all of these kinds of change, okay? So the first one is some things change very quickly. And you notice something, a behavior, something about yourself, and you might notice how unconscious it is, and you find it goes away like almost instantly. Just by becoming aware of it, it just sort of evaporates. And this very often happens early on. That's been my experience. These are habit patterns that are not very deep, and they often are easily seen through and easily dropped. So one of my Zen teachers shared a story with me decades ago where he said, you know, when he started meditating, he used to have this like nervous tic that he would do something with his hand. And then one day, after meditating a while, he just sort of, you know, was doing this tic with his hand, and he just thought, that's silly, and he never did it again. So that's a perfect example of one of these things that change quickly. And, you know, having a nervous tic, it's not the worst thing in the world, but very often when you have a nervous tic, it actually does make other people feel nervous or anxious. You're wasting energy. I mean, there's no real reason to be moving your hand nervously or tapping on something nervously. So it makes sense to just let it go. Why not, right? If you can. So that's a good example of the first kind of change that I'm talking about. The second kind of change is gradual change. And you may be practicing, meditating, doing spiritual work, and you see changes gradually. You maybe start to gradually become more patient. You gradually become less reactive. Maybe your diet gradually changes. All kinds of changes can happen in this way. Just gradually you find yourself maybe not reacting as much in certain situations. Now, oftentimes these gradual changes can still seem sudden. They just maybe aren't quick. So for instance, oftentimes we don't know that there's been a change until we're in a stressful situation, because it's very often the stressful situation that shows us how our reactivity has changed. As long as everything is going how I want, yeah, I'm going to seem enlightened, right? I'm going to be peaceful, I'm going to be happy. It's when things don't go how I would like them to go. That's the real test, you might say. And so how do we react under stress? How do we react when people are not agreeing with us, when people are maybe even being cruel to us? How do we respond to this? And so sometimes you might find that you don't feel like anything is changing. You're meditating, you're doing your practices, and there are no big revelations, and you haven't really seen any change. And you're thinking, gosh, like I'm doing this meditation, but nothing's happening. Okay, very common experience, but things are happening. That's been my experience. Whether you realize them or not, things are being rewired, things are changing, your nervous system is changing, your brain is changing. And so all of a sudden, some stressful thing happens, and you find yourself reacting very differently than you would have in the past. And so, again, the change might have been happening very slowly, but you didn't have regular intervals in which to experience that slow change. It changed, and by the time you had an opportunity to see that there was a change, a huge change had already occurred. So even though it was a gradual change, you didn't get to sample that along the way. There weren't enough stressful events along the way. And so, this can happen to people. They go to a family reunion that they haven't been to in 10 years. And the last time they went, it was absolute torture. And, they had shouting matches with people, and there was all kinds of things. And then they go, it could be after a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. Everyone is different in this regard. But you go back into this exact same situation that has stressed you out in the past, and you find you're completely free of stress. You don't get upset. Everyone else is acting the same. So it's not because everyone's on their best behavior. Again, it's easy to be enlightened, joyful, peaceful when everything's going our way. But we find that we no longer react to that situation anymore. So even though this was gradual, it seemed sudden. But that's the second kind of change, gradual change. The third kind of change is what I call change by grace. And so this is really where I really will say it's all grace. That's the reality of my experience. We don't really change anything, even with our practices. Our practices just make us open to grace. But this is something where we really recognize that we aren't going to be able to change something on our own, and we let go. And you could say the old saying is let go and let God. And so I believe this is part of a 10-step program or recovery programs. They have steps in there that are similar to this one. We realize that we can't make this change, and we let go, we surrender, we have faith, and we allow something greater than our small egoic identity to create the change, and it's changed for us. The ego is not involved at all. And I wrote a post many years ago now up on Patreon, which was titled "Stop Doing Your Meditation." And this is along those lines that many people think that meditation is something that they do. And the way that I teach it is it's really something that happens to you. All you do when you sit down is make yourself available for grace to come in and to happen. So this is the third kind of change by grace, by being blessed by what we could call divinity. Now, if you don't like that word God or divinity, it's fine. I didn't either when I first really got into deep spirituality. And to be honest, in a sense, they aren't necessary even. In Zen, we say there is really no difference between the sacred and the profane. So, some people like these words like God and divinity and faith. Other people prefer words like source and universe. And they prefer to talk about the brain. And for me, either will do at this point. I'm happy to speak either language with whatever someone is comfortable with. But what's important is the message, not really the words that we're using. In Zen, we have a saying that when someone's pointing at the moon, look at the moon and not the finger. So words like God, universe, source are pointers. And if we get too obsessed about which word we're using, then we're starting to look at the finger and we're missing the moon. So let's keep focused on what's important with these things. And so the final type of change is no change at all. And this can be very, very frustrating, and it can be a real trap for many people on a spiritual path. And so my next talk will be a little bit more about that. What happens when we are doing our spiritual work and there's no change at all? All right, everyone. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next talk. Namaste, and have a good day.